All right. Our scripture for today is from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8, verses 31 through 38. Hear the word of the Lord. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. For you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. This is a decently well-known passage, and the primary reason that it's well-known, I think, at least in my time, in my life, the advent of the social media era has made this passage more prevalent because of verse 38 that posts on social media often utilize, particularly this was particularly done during the early days of Facebook. So about the time I got on Facebook, which was when I was 12 in 2008, I got on Facebook and I would see posts like this all the time. These posts would have some artistic representation of Jesus. Generally, Jesus would look like a Swedish man, right? Not like a Middle Eastern, Palestinian, Jewish man, but it'd be a very pretty portrait of Jesus, and it would tell you to share the post that was on Facebook, right? Because otherwise you would be showing that you were ashamed of the Son of Man. You're ashamed of Jesus, and thus the Son of Man would also be ashamed of you. I don't know if y'all seen posts like that on Facebook before, but they're pretty common on there, or at least they were back in the day. I think they've moved on to other tactics. So this verse has been utilized to elicit guilt-ridden social media engagement, and I'm sure likely much other guilt in people's lives. I'd like to say that is not what we're talking about today, and that what God cares about with your interactions on social media or anywhere else is how are you engaging with people? Are you showing other people love? Or are you engaging in hateful, angry, and or divisive rhetoric and debate? And if you show other people love, then I believe that God will be very pleased with you when it comes down to it. But regardless, my focus today is not on verse 38. I do not believe that to be the focus of this passage. This passage begins with, "Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo." He talks about suffering and death and resurrection. This is a clear transition from the previous section of Mark. Mark 1:1 through 8:30 has been about establishing just who this Jesus guy really is. The beginning of the Gospel of Mark, of course, has the beginning of the good news, or gospel, of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. This is what Mark 1:1 through 8:30 has been about proving. This culminates in Jesus' question to his disciples in 8:27, just before this passage today. "Who do people say that I am?" The disciples, of course, answer in 8:28, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." Basically, there are a lot of potential answers to this question. Later, people answer the question with, "He's a threat." Even later, people answer, "Well, he never really existed." People answer that he was just a wise teacher. There are a lot of answers to this question. Who do people say that I am? Jesus then poses the question directly to the disciples in 8:29, but who do you say that I am? Rudolf Bultmann, who's a 20th century New Testament scholar, wrote concerning this question that every time the gospel is preached, it faces people with an existential decision and eschatological decision. So that's a decision of existence and a decision about the end of our lives. Every time we come face to face with the gospel, indeed every day we live, we have to answer this question anew. Who do you say that I am? And Peter gives us the answer that we're supposed to follow him in. You are the Christ. You are the Messiah. New Testament scholars state that this is the hinge statement of the Gospel of Mark. It turns, and that's where we see a turn in the narrative of the Gospel of Mark. All the previous 8 chapters have been an introduction to Jesus, and now we are ready to truly comprehend the mission of Jesus, what Jesus is here to do. My New Testament professor used the language of that Mark has an introduction, that's 1:1 through 8:30, followed by an extended passion narrative, because the rest is to do with the passion, with the death and resurrection of Jesus. As Lamar Williamson Jr. states regarding the shift, the Christological motif shifts from the fact of Jesus' messiahship, so Jesus is the Messiah, to the meaning of Jesus' messiahship. Thus, Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. This teaching concerning the suffering, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus is so important that Jesus again reasserts it in Mark 9:31 through 32. The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him, and 3 days after being killed, he will rise again. But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. And it's so important that Jesus again states it a 3rd time in the Gospel of Mark in 10:33 through 34. See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles, that is the Romans. They will mock him and spit upon him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days he will rise again. Why was this teaching so important? It seems somewhat passé to us in the United States, who have been a part of Christianity for much of our lives, who know nothing of a world with radically different messianic expectations. The messianic hope for first century Jews was very real and very present and very practical to their situation. And it wasn't individual, it was collective. The people of Israel, the Jewish people, were under occupation by the Romans. They were under oppression by the Romans. They weren't able to rule the way that they wanted to. And the Romans seemed very strong. It seemed to many that the Romans may last forever and rule the world forever. Some today may say that America will last forever, right? If we just keep it going, America will last forever. Of course, this did not turn out to be the case, as the Romans fell eventually. Just like all empires and all nations at some point do or will fall. But at the time, Rome surely seemed like an insurmountable enemy. In fact, by physical violence, the Jews proved no match for the Romans. Originally, when the Romans came in, they pretty easily conquered the nation of Israel. And then when the Jewish people revolted in the 60s, approximately 30 years after Jesus' death, they were defeated, and the temple was destroyed in 70 CE. And they followed this up. They kept their peace for a little while, and then they followed this up with another revolt in 135 called the Bar Kokhba revolt, and it was yet again struck down by the Romans. However, in these cases and in all the other instances of Jewish resistance or revolt before the time of Jesus, a key aspect was missing that the first century Jews believed would take care of the talent and power and ability and manpower gap between the two groups. The Messiah would come. When the Messiah came, his leadership and his divine power, his divine authority, would surely be sufficient to destroy the Romans and restore the kingdom to Israel. As one of the professors I know states, they all believed that the Messiah would come and the Messiah would make Israel great again. So the identification of Jesus as Messiah was huge. If Jesus was indeed who the people had been waiting for all these years, then perhaps their struggles were finally over. Perhaps the kingdom would finally be restored to Israel. Thus, when Jesus says this outrageous statement about suffering and dying, Peter takes him aside. His immediate response is to take him aside. And his response is understandable. He takes him to the side and he likely gently began to rebuke him. 8:32. It doesn't say gently, but I imagine he probably wasn't very assertive about it. He just tried to remind Jesus, I don't think you get this whole Messiah thing. Being Messiah means that you're going to lead us into the kingdom again, that you're going to restore our once great nation. You just don't get it, Jesus. So Jesus rebukes Peter, and many focus on the get behind me, Satan aspect of this, and they talk about how harsh it seems that Jesus said that to him. But I do not think that this was likely as harsh as we may read it. The emphasis was not on this identification of Peter with the devil or anything like that. The emphasis is on the second sentence here in 8:33. For you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Williamson states, the issue is who is in charge. To say Christ to someone, which is what Peter has just said, is to give up the right to define what Christ means. It is to acknowledge the other's authority, the Christ, to define the term, and with it, the meaning of that confession. There is a human way to define the meaning of Jesus as Messiah, and then there is a divine way. The human way is the way of the first century people of Israel. Human things, human people worry about temporal rule, about the political powers of the day, about the current oppressive structures in place, whether they be Romans or Democrats, Herodians or Republicans. These things, these human matters, are certainly important. Politics is important. They deserve some thought. The people of Israel were feeling oppressed by the Romans. They wanted and they needed deliverance. And they believed that the biblical text promised it to them. But while these matters are important, they are human matters. When God bursts onto the scene in the person of Jesus Christ, he is nothing like the human expectation. To me, this is one of the strongest arguments in favor of the truth of Christianity. True biblical Christianity does not make sense to the human mind. In fact, just like Peter, rational humans should rebuke the idea of a divine Messiah that should suffer and die. If we are to believe that only one human religion has the fullness of truth, and this is certainly what Jesus seems to claim in John 14:6 when he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, then we can acknowledge that much of what makes up human religious activity is invented by humans. Indeed, much of Christian thought and practice has likely been a human invention. The fact that we have 30,000, 40,000 denominations indicates that somebody's making some stuff up. Some of this stuff is not valid. But the idea that it is backed up by is an idea which at its core is a divine thing. This person of Jesus, the person of Jesus is divine. When humans invent God or gods, they never come out looking like Jesus. Like Brennan Manning says, when we create God in our own image, he comes out just as hateful and self-centered and all the other negative emotions the gods of human invention would never subject themselves to human life. All you have to do is go read Greco-Roman mythology or any religious text basically outside of Christianity, outside of Judaism as well, which obviously Christianity springs from. The gods of human invention would never subject themselves to human life. The gods of human invention would never subject themselves to human suffering. The gods of human invention would never subject themselves to human death. Jesus subjects himself to all three. He is subjected to the pains and pleasures of daily human life, the anxieties and the negative emotions and the positive emotions of human life. He is subjected to all facets of human suffering, surely from minor cuts, scrapes, and bruises, from bad attitudes, and from all sorts of sad times that I'm sure he experienced, all the way up to the extreme suffering that he endured in the crucifixion, to the extreme agony, mental and emotional agony that he felt knowing what was about to take place. Finally, God himself, Jesus Christ, God in the flesh, is subjected to death, the final result of all human life, that human experience that is, Derrida writes, nobody else can undergo or confront in my place. Thus, Jesus truly does know what it is like to be human. God knows what it is like to be human, not in the way that a being that knows everything can know what it is like to be human, but in the way that only someone who has lived, has truly lived, can know what it is like. The triumph and tragedies of human existence are not merely a known experience for God, something that he knows about, but something that God himself has lived through. This, to me, is a huge selling point for the truth of Christianity, for the truth of Jesus Christ as God incarnate. Because no one would make this story up. How does Jesus enter the human world? Not in all power, not as a huge commanding figure with a deep, booming voice, but as a helpless infant, dependent upon others. Surely he will grow into power. Surely he will grow and kick out the Romans for good, take over the world himself, and create a worldwide Jewish empire. Surely the kingdom of Israel will come again. Thus the reign of God would come through earthly conquest. This makes sense to the human mind. The powers of humanity bending and breaking before the omnipotent God made flesh. And Jesus does grow into power of sorts, like the Gospel of Luke tells us in Luke 2:52, and Jesus increased in wisdom and in years and in divine and human favor. Jesus then works great miracles, exhibiting divine power. Perhaps he has come to restore the kingdom after all. Yet no. This passage clearly establishes the meaning of Jesus' messiahship. It is not to establish an earthly kingdom or to exert any type of power over people. Like all humans do, we seek to exert power over people. But instead of following the human way, instead of thinking like a human and exerting power over other people, Jesus submits to being under other people. He submits to being tortured and being crucified. God comes into the world as a helpless infant dependent upon others and leaves the world as a helpless adult, dying at the hands of his own creation. This is not a God of human invention. So our challenge today is the same as every day. Will we take up our own cross and follow this God? As verse 34 tells us. So what does this mean to take up our cross and to follow him? This was to the early church the very nature of being a Christian. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the 20th century Lutheran pastor who was eventually executed by the Nazi regime, he states thus, the cross is not misfortune and hard fate. It is instead the suffering that comes to us from being bound to Jesus Christ. The cross is not accidental, but necessary suffering. The cross is not suffering bound up with natural existence, but suffering bound up with being a Christian. The cross is essentially not just suffering, but suffering and being rejected, and also, strictly speaking, being rejected for Jesus Christ's sake. The cross means suffering along with While it is true that life is full of many unique pains and sufferings, all of which we can be assured that God himself has experienced in the person of Jesus Christ. Taking up our cross is more than just accepting the human suffering, which is so prevalent to all people. The life we are called to in Jesus Christ, this is, I believe, what taking up the cross is, should not be an easy one. If we find the Christian life easy, then it is unlikely, I'm not going to rule you out, but it is unlikely that we are living the life of discipleship into which Christ calls us. American Christianity over the last 30, really more like 50 years, has seen a great decline. For instance, the United Methodist Church has gone from, I think, 12 million people in the U.S. upon formation to about 7 million people in the U.S. today. And that is across the board. Every denomination except for a couple years ago, the Assemblies of God was still growing, but they're not growing anymore in the U.S. Everybody is going down. Christianity is declining in the U.S. And so American Christianity, in the face of this reality, this decline, has often adopted a model of trying to be more and more appealing. Because this was the old model that used to seem to work. That we could be the church that was there and people would just come on in. And sometimes that still happens. But the thought today is, well, if we just get good enough music, people will come back into the church, right? If we just get good enough children's programs, people will come back. If we just get good enough youth programs, people will come back. If we preach for the political stances that the majority of the people in our area are for, or if we preach against the political stances the majority of the people in our area are against, then people will come to our church. If we talk about how much money people who have faith or who love Jesus more will have, then people will come into the church. If we just make Christianity look appealing enough, look worth it by human standards, by human thoughts, a common theme today, then people will come into the church in droves. This has worked to an extent in some individual cases. There are many churches that have grown, and that's why people keep adopting the model. But overall, it fails. Even if it numerically succeeds in certain instances, it fails for one primary reason. It is not biblical Christianity. And thus it fails to lead people into living the life into which Jesus has called us in this passage. In contrast to so many American Christians today, so many American church leaders today, the early church lived the words of Jesus. They took him seriously when he told them to take up their cross and follow him. They willingly died at the hands of the oppressive government without lifting a finger in retaliation. They simply spoke words of faithfulness to Jesus Christ and words of love for those who killed them. They were martyred in droves. They were driven underground. They had to meet in the tombs, in the catacombs of the cities. They only brought people into the church after a year or more long process of instruction in the faith, which is wild to us today because we let people in as soon as they come in. And I'm not saying we should change that, but they took a year or more of instructing people in the faith. And the crazy thing is, with all of those, with the stringent requirements and with the persecution that they face, and with all the problems of their world, they grew. The early church's model of church growth was not better programs. It was really not better preaching. It was not. It was not an emphasis on money or an emphasis on the greatness of the life with Jesus. The early church's model of church growth was a radical dependence upon the gospel, its power to heal and its power to save all people. So I encourage you today, to think and pray, and I can't tell you this myself because I am trying to figure it out for my own self. Pray about what it may mean for you personally to take up your cross and follow the crucified Jesus. This is what Jesus is calling us to today